Welcome to all of you who are logging in right now. We'll give it a minute or two to give folks a chance to log in as they scurry from other meetings and so forth. So we'll be back in just about a minute. Many people are still logging in to today's call, so we're going to give another 30 seconds or so to give people an opportunity to get on the call, and then we'll begin. Thank you, everybody. All right, we will get started. Welcome to all of you for this National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable housing. We have a great call lined up for you today. My name is Paul Keeley. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'll serve as the MC for today's call. We have a great lineup. We have Jasmine Rangel and Jacob Haas from the Eviction Lab, who'll be talking to us about their latest data from the eviction tracking system. Jessica Perez and Abby Boschart from the Urban Institute will discuss how we can leverage behavioral science to get emergency rental assistance into the hands of those most in need faster. We'll get the latest on NLIHC's Erase project and rental arrears to stop evictions project, about immediate federal, state, and local actions needed to protect renters, and the latest information we have on our tracking of emergency rental assistance programs throughout the country. We'll share the latest updates from Capitol Hill, especially regarding the infrastructure and spending packages, where things stand and what we still need to do as advocates. We'll hear updates from the field and more. I just want to remind everybody, if you would please, if you have questions for the panelists and speakers, please enter them into the Q&A that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. There's also a chat box, and you're welcome to chat with one another, to share links or whatever. But generally, I'll be looking at the Q&A for any questions you might have for today's speakers and panelists. We may not get to every question. I'll apologize ahead of time, but they're all important to us because they help inform us about the work that we're doing, about our FAQs, about information we put up on our website and so forth. So please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer some of them during today's call. Okay, so for our first speakers, we will have a presentation on leveraging behavioral science and emergency rental assistance distribution. Jessica Perez from the Urban Institute and Abby Boschart from the Metropolitan and Housing and Communities Policy Center have agreed to join us. So I'm going to turn it over to Jessica and Abby.
Awesome, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the National Low Income Housing Coalition for inviting us to join today. We really value the critical work you're doing during this time. As mentioned, my name is Jessica Perez, and I'm from the Urban Institute. I am joined today by my colleague, Abby Boschart. Today, we want to offer some insight on the role behavioral science can play in expediting emergency rental assistance. Next slide, please. One more. So with that, we can dive right in. So behavioral science is the study of how people make decisions. As humans, our decision-making is often imperfect. And with this realization, governments have adopted behavioral science strategies like nudges to help streamline decision-making. And a way to nudge people is to present information or choices in a manner that positions them to choose the option that best benefits them. So with that in mind, governments have used behavioral science techniques to achieve the following outcomes, such as increasing engagement of residents into programs and incentives. Behavioral science can also offer support in identifying bottlenecks in program design. And finally, it can support finding ways to streamline a process. Next slide, please. So how do these strategies translate to emergency rental assistance? As we know, there has been a severe lag in ERA distribution, and much of that is a direct result of structural barriers that have impeded people from taking up available resources. In our research, we identified 3 different areas that behavioral science can play a key role in. The first one is increasing the ease of applications by leveraging existing programs. And what we mean by that is using programs like SNAP and Medicaid to cast a wider net of applicants. These programs can utilize their networks of recipients by sending letters or emails with messaging that enrollment in their programs means that they qualify for emergency rental assistance. The rationale behind that is when people think they already qualify for assistance or get that confirmation, they will be more inclined to apply. So the second item we want to highlight is personalized outreach efforts. So to attract some of the most vulnerable renters, localities can create personalized outreach that is both accessible and informational. This should include clear messaging with a direct call to action and deadlines. This way, applicants know what is expected of them and by when. Another helpful item to consider in messaging is outlining the ease in process. People will respond better when they see tangible steps to completing the application and ways to seek assistance if they need help. Finally, the last example I want to share with you all is behavioral science can help with tracking the effectiveness in your program design. One area to explore and experiment with is your applications. So for example, you can run 2 groups. One group is asked to complete an application that requires you to upload documents as the first step. And then the second group would be asked to complete an application that requires you to upload documents as the last step. Evidence from these 2 parallel groups can offer insight that may demonstrate that uploading documents is a barrier to some people. So as a result, tracking these data can identify pain points in ERA application design that program administrators can then troubleshoot to ease the process or help with redesigning a more accessible ERA application that meets the needs of everyone. And with that, I turn it over to my colleague, Abby, to talk more about our resources.
Thank you, Jessica. As she mentioned, my name is Abby Bossart, and it's great to be with you all today. I will be talking about our equity checklist for program administrators that is designed to help rental assistance programs more effectively target households at the highest risk of housing instability by prioritizing racial equity in program design and implementation. This is a companion to our emergency rental assistance priority index tool, which maps where low-income renters face the highest risk of housing instability. And this checklist features many of the behavioral science techniques that Jessica just mentioned. It is critical that we center racial equity in emergency rental assistance program design because, as many of you know, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities have experienced some of the most severe impacts of the pandemic due to generations of racist policies and systemic discrimination that threaten communities of color long before COVID-19. Our checklist guides program design to prioritize racial equity in 3 main areas: program structure, outreach and engagement, and data collection and program monitoring. Program administrators can consider the following factors to structure a program with racial equity goals, including prioritizing recipients based on risk of housing instability or pairing with other local data sources to determine risk, designing applications to promote accessibility for vulnerable groups, expanding rental assistance delivery methods, such as utilizing direct-to-tenant payments, employing landlord-tenant mitigation strategies, and strengthening partnerships and defining roles with community organizations. Local programs can increase awareness and reach hard to reach communities by developing the following strategies for outreach and engagement: geographically targeting outreach to trusted organizations and community leaders, utilizing touch points with other safety net services, providing education to landlords and owners, and conducting community engagement to inform program design. Finally, data collection and program monitoring are critical to ensuring programs are reaching at-risk communities and not reinforcing existing inequities. Localities can achieve this by tracking important data points, such as applicant demographics, average relief amount received, or the typical time it takes someone to complete an application, identifying which communities are being served, collecting qualitative data to eliminate trends, and tracking long-term impacts of households, and finally, building capacity to conduct this type of data collection and monitoring. And if you go to the next slide, the Urban Institute is offering no-cost technical assistance to emergency rental assistance programs. We can assist local programs with program building and implementation, as well as targeting outreach and funding dissemination. Again, this assistance is being offered at no cost to the program. If you're interested in this opportunity or have any questions for us, you could email us at erap@urban.org. And if you go to the next slide, we have linked some of the resources that we had discussed today. Thank you again for the opportunity to share our work with you this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Abby and Jessica. There was a question that I think one of our staff answered, which is great because it was more personal assistance kind of thing. I do have a question for you here, and that is, do you have any examples of groups that have been using the behavioral science method to track effectiveness as Jessica described? And I guess for Abby, are there groups that are employing sort of the equity checklist or something very similar that you're aware of? And do you have any comments about their experiences with those? I don't know if Jessica wants to start first. It's kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, of course. So one example that I can think of clearly is the one of Newark, New Jersey. So it's not necessarily rental assistance, but back in 2019, they had issues with having some of their landlords, local landlords, register their units for affordable housing, and they didn't see it as necessary. So the city of Newark was able to leverage behavioral science and create this letter with a direct call to action, deadlines, what's at stake. And they issued this particular letter to one group of landlords. And then they issued another letter with not as direct a call to action and not with any examples of how to seek assistance. And what they saw with the first group that was able to have this more comprehensive letter, they were able to get 20% more of people to register, or landlords to register their units for affordable housing. So that was an increase in engagement from the landlords to help address the affordability, housing affordability in Newark, New Jersey.
Great.
And I can share that resource out as well.
Fantastic. That's great.
As far as the equity checklist, this is something that we are actively using with some of the localities that we are doing the technical assistance with. So we're still kind of looking at the impacts of these and how we're able to implement them. I mean, as many of you know, this is kind of a rapidly evolving thing, and everyone is trying to kind of implement a lot of these and able to get this assistance out in time, but we're hoping to able to share some more information about the checklist and its impact later on.
Outstanding. And you have this outstanding resource of really free technical assistance. We really encourage everybody to take advantage of that. A number of people did ask that the links that are shared on this last slide also be included in the chat, and we have done that. So thank you very much to Elena for having done that. There was a question here. I'm not sure I understand it exactly. It says, what sort of data sharing would be needed for communities to leverage programs like this? Pretty open-ended question. Does it trigger anything you guys want to share?
Sure. So as part of the equity checklist, we list a few different other types of local services that programs could tap into data for about working with working more closely with the continuums of care and using HMIS data, or as well as other type of social services such as food banks or other safety net. And sort of that information, you'd have to work directly with those organizations to see what kind of agreements you need, what to make sure that you're protecting all of the participant sensitive data and things like that. But because a lot of these other local organizations and programs do have indicators about individuals who are at risk, that can be really helpful for these programs being able to target those who are really facing housing instability and other financial insecurity.
Great. Here's a question from Ian Gabriel on using other assistance programs, SNAP, WIC, and so forth, for eligibility for ERA. How do you recommend reconciling income eligibility guidelines in federal ERA legislation, 80% AMI for all persons residing in the household, with eligibility for other programs, which are often based on federal poverty guidelines and are for individuals or nuclear families?
So the most direct example I can share is Allegheny County has been working with local hospitals to look at some of the Medicaid recipients in their area and use that as justification for meeting the federal requirement of Treasury for ERA. So I would direct Ian to look into that, and I can definitely pass along resources on that and how they were able to do that in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania.
Great, and here's a question from Jacob Ferguson from the land of Lincoln and Champaign, Illinois. Do you have example letters to aid providers that have been able to accelerate the disbursement of payments, or advice for how to create an impactful letter to accompany a client application to make clear that aid providers should accept self-attestation per the guidance coming from the federal government?
I can handle this one. So I can definitely share the behavioral science example of the Newark example. And then I've seen some pretty comprehensive social media toolkits across jurisdictions like Virginia that have translated their ERA announcement in multiple languages. That has resonated really well. And Virginia is one of the better performing programs at the moment. But just looking at the different social media toolkits that exist, I know the Consumer Finance Bureau has also created a tool to help renters access their local programs and different social media strategies that they can employ as well.
I will also just chime in that the National Low Income Housing Coalition has a resource hub of great tools that programs have used very successfully for all kinds of things. So you'll hear more about that later in the call, but please access the Emergency Rental Assistance Resource Hub that NLIHC has created with all kinds of models from other programs that can be adapted and stolen, borrowed, whatever you want to say, to make your programs more effective. So Abby and Jessica, thank you so much for being on this call, presenting and answering these questions. Great resources. Great technical assistance that's now available. So thank you so much for sharing.
Of course, thank you for having us.
Okay, great. Okay, we will move on in our agenda to our next couple of presenters. We're going to get an update on the eviction tracking system from Eviction Lab, from Jasmine Rangel and Jacob Haas. Jasmine and Jacob, are you there?
Right here, ready to go.
Very good, it's all yours.
All right, thank you so much. Could we start with the next slide, please? All right, thank you so much. Sorry, one before, it's great. Thank you all for having us on the call today. My name is Jasmine Rangel. I'm a research specialist at the Eviction Lab, and I'm joined by my colleague, Jacob Haas, who is also a research specialist at the lab. With the livelihood, health, and overall well-being of millions at risk, especially and increasingly so after the recent SCOTUS decision, we thought it important to understand how the CDC moratorium and additional local moratoriums have affected eviction filings and the thousands who have faced an eviction filing throughout the course of the pandemic. Next slide, please. Looking at things fairly broadly, the CDC moratorium helped prevent over 1.5 million eviction filings nationwide. In total, we estimate that the combination of federal, state, and local policies have helped to prevent at least 2.4 million eviction filings since the start of the pandemic. More specifically, in our data and the sites that we track from September of 2020 to July 31st of 2021, we've been able to observe 360,000 filings across the sites that we track. And while this equals to about half of the total evictions we would expect during the same time frame in a typical year, we've avoided almost 500,000 filings. But this is still a really traumatic outcome for hundreds of thousands of households across the country. Next slide, please. Now, the eviction filings that we saw varied across the country because of state and local policy decisions. Some states and cities employed different or additional tactics to keep families safely housed during the pandemic, and others chose not to follow and enforce the CDC moratorium guidelines on evictions during the pandemic. Even sites doing well without a formal additional local moratorium often had good protections in place. For example, Philadelphia did a really great job of setting up a robust eviction diversion program and saw their filings fall below 30% of their typical historical norms. On the other hand, though, other cities we observed their eviction filings during the pandemic to be much closer to their historical averages, suggesting that the CDC moratorium had very little effect on their eviction patterns. For example, in all three sites that we track in Florida, all three of those had filings above 75% of their historical averages. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Jasmine. So in our team's research, something that we see year after year is that it's often a small number of landlords and a small number of neighborhoods that drive a large share of eviction filings in a given city. So in response to this, we've started tracking and publishing on our website the top evicting buildings in certain cities that we collect data on. So right now, if you go to our website, which the link is on this slide, you can see that data for 11 or 12 cities, and we hope to expand that to more cities in the weeks to come. And the hope for this is that you all, the local stakeholders, can use this data and identify eviction filing hotspots and can better target assistance and can better help residents that are most at risk of displacement. Next slide, please. So this is what you'll see if you go to our website for Houston, Texas. The first thing you'll notice is that the building with the most eviction filings during the pandemic filed upwards of 200 eviction filings, and that the top 100 buildings in Houston filed almost 20% of all of the eviction filings during the pandemic. Next slide, please. And so it's not just Houston where this is occurring. In Memphis, for example, it's just 100 buildings that make up almost 40% of all of the eviction filings during the pandemic. And in Greenville, South Carolina, that statistic is almost 50%. Next slide, please. And so like I mentioned earlier, it's not just buildings where eviction filings are concentrated, but it's the same neighborhoods that we see evictions year after year in. And so you can see this in Tampa, Florida, for example. On the left side, you can see where eviction filings are occurring prior to the pandemic. And on the right side map, you can see that it's these exact same neighborhoods, more or less, that are seeing eviction filings during the pandemic and during the CDC moratorium period.
We've also been able to estimate the demographic makeup of those who were filed against during the moratorium. And like before the pandemic, eviction filings continued to disproportionately affect the same demographic groups, particularly Black renters. In fact, we estimate that Black renters faced 33% of eviction filings during the CDC moratorium, despite making up only around 22% of renters. Next slide, please. So you may be asking, where do we go from here and what's next for all of us? So our collective future has many different paths and all are dependent on the actions that are taken from here on out. On the optimistic side, perhaps emergency supports such as rental assistance and improved processes to getting money to families who need it can keep eviction filing rates below average. However, as we all know, this aid is still really slow to get out and spending rates of ERA money vary largely from state to state. So then on the more pessimistic side, evictions could go back to the same crisis rates as before the pandemic. This is very likely to happen since we've been able to observe spikes in filings between when the CARES Act protections expired and when the CDC moratorium went into place in September of 2020. Additionally, and still on the pessimistic side, eviction filings could worsen compared to what we know as quote unquote normal rates, as tenants are further behind in rent payments and fewer states have additional emergency protections in place. Additionally, the recently cut unemployment benefits could also continue to strain the budgets of many households across the country. Now, either way, each future still treats an eviction as an inevitable, but any eviction that's allowed to be filed is still a violent act against community members in our areas. So states and localities have the power to protect tenants from being displaced, such as improving access to rental assistance, instituting local eviction moratoria, mandating eviction diversion programs, and even targeting interventions towards the tenants or the owners of the top evicting buildings that we've shown you here today. We hope that some of this information and some of the newest tools that we've provided here for you today will help you to continue to make the case in your neighborhoods about what needs to be done to keep families safely and healthily housed for now and into the future. Next slide, please. And we thank you for your time today. We can take any questions you might have, but the information to access the research and our latest blog post is here, as well as our contact information for any future questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine and Jacob. Great information. As always, the Eviction Lab work you do is so incredibly vital. Just a really quick question. You know, we're kind of keeping our ears open just for sort of anecdotal information or press information, media information. Are you guys getting any sense for how things are going in now that the CDC eviction moratorium has been ended? Are you keeping your finger on the pulse of anything that would give you some indication of how things are going in terms of evictions right now?
Sure. So week to week, we publish updated eviction filing data on our website on the eviction tracking system. Our next update will be coming live tomorrow. And it'll cover all of the eviction filings in the cities and states we track for this past week, which was the first full week after the SCOTUS decision. So hopefully this week and then in the next few weeks to come, we'll start gathering more good data on what's been happening in terms of eviction filings in the areas we track.
Great, and so the information that you provided earlier about, you know, the CDC eviction moratorium probably prevented 1.5 million eviction filings compared to a usual year, and 2.4 million if you count all the other local measures that have been taken, put in place. Those are projections based on your relatively modest sample, but projecting out if you applied that more nationally. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And our modest sample covers about a quarter of all renters in the nation. So we have a good enough chunk to be able to make these projections. Great.
And the data that you're talking about being released tomorrow and thereafter, will it do the same thing? We'll say, you know, here's based on the localities we're tracking, and if this was applied nationally, it would probably be X.
So we don't publish our national our national estimates extrapolating on our website, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, very good. I was just curious about that. There are a couple of questions in here. How do you get eviction locations in the cities? Is the address part of the public record? Was one of the questions we have.
Yeah, so in these cities, yeah, address information for the defendants is part of the public record, and we have a process to match the addresses listed on the eviction filings to parcel data. in the cities that we're putting this information out for, and then aggregating and consolidating based off of that.
Great. Jerry Poe asked the question, do you have any thoughts about the patterns of self-evictions and their relation to your data?
Good question. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to track self-evictions because when the eviction data that we have within our own possession ultimately always is filed within the courts, and it's all court data. And when someone does a self-eviction, unfortunately, that doesn't go to court, and so we're missing a lot of that vital information.
Nathan Reeder asks if you know what the typical ratio of eviction filings to actual evictions is.
I don't have something off the top of my head. I know that there's some other members of our team on this call. Maybe they can know something in the chat, but it's certainly, I mean, this number of evictions is certainly less than the number of filings. We publish national estimates based off of our 2000 to 2016 data on our website, but I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head.
Okay, so maybe a visit to your website would be a good idea for that individual. And then Gabby Sprague says it's incredibly difficult to gather eviction data in our local community. Do you have any advice or suggested avenues in which to go about acquiring that?
So I mean, we get most of our data from scraping websites from local courts. Often courts will have aggregate case filings that they'll send out. My first recommendation would be to go to the courts and see if they have any information or are willing to provide anything. Jasmine, I don't know if you have any thoughts beyond that.
Oh, you answered it really well.
Okay, and then another question from an anonymous attendee is, who are the local eviction experts that should be brought in to help with emergency rental assistance programs? And there's a question, judges. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
My initial inclination is always to go towards tenant organizers. They're probably the ones that are closest working with tenants who are either facing an eviction or are settling disputes with their landlords. They're probably the ones that would be the best to know the ins and outs of your court system as well. So I would highly recommend getting in touch with your organizers and listening to your local tenant organizers about what's going on with eviction patterns in your local cities.
Great. I'm going to give one more question because I'm kind of interested. Although there are some more questions in the Q&A box, if you have a minute or two to stay around and answer some of those by typing answer, that would be great. But how do you get the racial composition of those evicted?
Yeah, so that's a good question because race and ethnicity isn't in public court data. These are sort of rough estimates. We base it off of the geographic location that renters are in, and we impute it based off geography and their last name and census data relating to the racial makeup of people with those locations and names. So it's a rough estimate, but it's gotten us fairly. It's the best we can do given the data that we're given.
Fantastic. Well, Jacob and Jasmine, again, there are a couple more questions that have come in. If you have a moment to take a look at them, and if there are answers that you can provide, that'd be great. But I just want to thank you so much, and always thank the Eviction Lab for all the phenomenal work that you're doing. We rely on you guys, and you do a phenomenal job. So thank you so much for presenting today and for all the work you do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we will move on now to field updates, and we have with us Brian Brendan Cheney, Director of Policy and Communications at the New York Housing Conference, and Ellen Davidson, Staff Attorney at Legal Aid Society. So I'm going to turn it over to you all. Please take it away.
Okay, I will start. Hi, I'm Ellen Davidson. I'm a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society. Last week, our legislature went into an extraordinary session, that's apparently its official title, and passed a number of amendments to bills to continue protections for tenants who are facing eviction. And so I was asked to come and talk about what those were. The first and the most exciting is that about a week or 2 weeks before the Supreme Court came in and devastated the CDC moratorium, the SCOTUS did the same thing to New York's moratorium. It overruled a decision by our Second Circuit to allow a case to be appealed without a stay. But the Supreme Court found that our eviction law, which allowed a tenant to submit a hardship declaration and then did not allow a landlord to challenge that hardship declaration, that violated the landlord's due process rights. So one of the things that happened in the extraordinary session is that our legislature has now provided landlords with a path to challenge hardship declarations. But in the same time, they went back and extended our eviction law till January 15th. So now if you're a tenant who's facing eviction and has had a hardship due to COVID, you can submit a hardship declaration. And if your landlord doesn't challenge it, your case will be put on hold until January 15th. If your landlord does challenge it, there will be a hearing about whether or not you faced a hardship. The second law that was changed is that we have a law called the Tenant Safe Harbor Act, which I think there are laws that are similar in California and in New Jersey. And it says that if a tenant is being sued for non-payment of rent, and if that tenant had a financial hardship due to COVID, the landlord can get a money judgment, but not a possessory judgment, which means that the tenant cannot be evicted for not paying that judgment amount. And that time period, it's the rent that comes due from March 7th, 2020, now through January 15th, 2022. And then the third law that was changed was our emergency rent relief program, our ERAP program. And there were some changes made to that, but mainly to allow localities that opted out of the state program to access the protections. The tenants will now be protected by the state law, and will and if their localities run out of money, those tenants can then apply for rent relief. The third law is called ERAP, Emergency Rent Assistance Program. Our ERAP program already protects tenants. If you apply, your landlord can't move forward in a case against you. And if your landlord cooperates with the program and accepts money, he cannot raise rent for a year and cannot bring an eviction based on any other reason other than new non-payment for a year. And so now tenants who are in local programs will have that protection. If landlords don't cooperate in New York, tenants will then, the program will consider whether those tenants are eligible for rent relief and will provide them with what's called a provisional approval. And the tenant can use that provisional approval as a defense in a case if a landlord tries to evict. And so what's been interesting about our program, which if anyone looked at the Treasury Department's report, you will have seen that as of the end of July, New York State was the worst program in the country for getting money out. If you look on the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's tracker, we've now either given out, obligated, or we've actually sent out 100% of our ERAP 1 funding. Our program has been challenging. I don't want to make it sound like it works well. It has a lot of the same problems that I think everyone has had across the country. We have a complicated website that crashes. We do allow self-attestations, which has been helpful. But even with the self-attestation, just doing the application takes time, uploading documents takes more time. But the biggest problem we're having at the moment is that the state is having a difficulty connecting the landlord applications to the tenant applications, and they can't pay the landlords until those 2 applications get linked. So it's not clear to us whether landlords aren't cooperating or their applications are getting lost. But from the tenant advocate's point of view, tenants continue to be protected. But we would like the program to work, and we would like money to come out. But in the last month, a lot of work has been done. There's a lot more to be done. I think I talked about what I needed to. Brendan, was there something I left out?
I don't think so. No, that's right. I mean, Ellen, you guys have been doing a ton of work on this. The program, like Ellen said, was one of the worst in the country, and thanks to a lot of advocacy from groups in New York, like Ellen's, I think we contribute as well, but really a lot of work to try and get the program turned around, to get the administration to make small improvements, like allowing you to save applications in the middle of the process, things like that. So, I think it's been good. And we also, for those of you following the politics, we've got a new governor that took over recently and has really focused on turning the program around and getting the money out to the tenants that need it. So that's been really helpful. So I think that's everything on ERAP and the moratorium. I'm just going to chime in real quick on one more field update from New York. We are releasing a report later this week, I think, hopefully. We did an economic impact analysis on what would happen if the federal government implemented universal rental assistance. And so we looked at, we looked at how would it increase household spending, how would, other benefits to households if everybody, again, it's if everybody who's eligible for rental assistance for Section 8 were to get it, what other benefits would come to them around decreasing homelessness, improving education and health, things like that. And then looking at consumer spending in the economy because of that change, new jobs, and increased tax revenue. And so we looked at this in, statewide and in New York City. The idea is that, I think you can see the same idea and the same things would happen in other states if there was universal rental assistance, as President Biden called for, and as others in Congress are working towards. So I'm going to put a link. We're going to have a webinar hopefully this week that really lays out and shows the findings from the report, just how big the economic impact would be, the jobs impact, household impact, things like that. We'll have a webinar explaining all of that. I'm going to put a link to that in the chat, and hopefully everyone who's interested can join the webinar and learn more about it. I think that's it on our end. We're happy to answer any questions.
Great, Brendan and Ellen, thank you so much for that really informative presentation. There are some questions that have come in. I have one as well. You talked to Ellen about the big challenge now is linking these, the tenant application with the landlord application. Does New York do direct to tenant assistance if they can't make that link?
No, there was a decision made during the legislative process. Our former governor was very against the idea of tenants getting direct assistance. he had all sorts of ideas of who tenants were and why they shouldn't get the money directly. So what the legislature did was say that if a landlord doesn't cooperate, here are all the protections we'll put in place for tenants. So the tenant will get an approval, which they can then bring to court and show a judge, which we're hoping will help. Additionally, the assistance is considered a source of income discrimination, a source of income for our source of income discrimination law. And so we're hoping to be able to connect the Attorney General's office, the Human Rights Commission, with landlords who are not wanting to cooperate. But because of the mess of the program on the landlord side at the moment, it's really challenging to figure out how much of the problem is landlords who aren't cooperating and versus landlords who are cooperating. But the program that was created for the assistance is not working to connect landlord and tenant applications. Part of that is, I think this happened in a lot of different places. They went out, they found national organizations to build this website, and nobody sat down with any of the stakeholders to understand whether the program made any sense. And so most property in New York State is owned by different LLCs. And the program really doesn't work if you own multiple LLCs. It requires you to create new email addresses for each LLC and upload documents in a very time-intensive way. We came from an administration that had no interest in transparency or working with anyone else, and that has caused difficulties.
I will say, we were, of course, as you'd imagine, watching New York, nothing was happening in terms of emergency rental assistance. And then it just took off like crazy. So that was very, very encouraging. Do you have any sense, I think the data that we have, and maybe our team can answer this as well, shows that this really significant amount of ERA $1 has been approved or distributed. Do you know, is there a lot that's been approved, but it can't be distributed because of this landlord-tenant matching? And is there a lot of money just sitting there waiting to be distributed?
Yeah, it's about almost $900 million, where they've gone through the tenant's application, determined the tenant was eligible, and they have, as I said, and we've been asking for this information, which we don't have it as of yet. But we need to, we'd like to know how much of it is a problem of a landlord who completed an application and how much of it is a problem of a landlord who didn't complete an application. And then we think there are a set of landlords who haven't even started applications. And some of that may be they haven't been contacted. We need more data. I mean, I was listening to the other people talking about the importance of data. We think the program is hitting the right people and getting to the right people, but we don't have enough data to do the analysis. We want census tract data instead of zip code level data, because that's what you need in order to understand who's being reached. But it's the same thing with the landlords. We know there's a problem. We know that there are various explanations for the problem. We don't know how many people fit into what bucket.
So there are a few questions in the Q&A asking, I'll do it in a sort of multi-part, and you can address whatever you can address. How many more staff in New York were hired to administer the program? And did the state consider usual channels and organizations, or did they need to create this program because it was federal money? And what platform is being used? Is it a completely new platform that was developed?
Yeah, it's a completely new platform that was developed. As people know, the state got a certain amount of money and localities got a certain amount of money, but the localities that got the money, it was 45% of their proportion of the population, and that took no consideration of their proportion of renters. So New York City, where I'm from, has about 65% of the renters in the state and got 20% of the money. So quickly, New York State decided to join the state program so that it would have access to as much funding as possible. And I think one of the things that's become clear, some of you may have read about our unemployment insurance debacle that happened at the beginning of the crisis, where the mechanism for applying for unemployment insurance just crashed and people were left without benefits for months. You know, we don't have great we don't have great websites or any other technical programs in New York State. We've had a very fiscally conservative governor for the past 12 years or 11 years, however long he was, and never wanted to put money into anything to make things work, unless it was a road or a bridge. But when it came to what the programs that helped low-income people survive, there's been very little updating. And so in order to have this program work, they needed to build a new platform, which they did by hiring a lot of outside vendors. Some place called Guidehouse. Nan McKay was involved in some way. We're still trying to figure out who all the vendors are and what they did. Deloitte Touche has been the people answering the phones, but there are a lot of private national entities that came in. We spent $100 million on the whole thing, and we're still, and hopefully with this new administration, we'll get some more information about who did what. But that is some of the reasons why it's been so challenging.
Great. Well,
yeah.
Ellen and Brendan, there are more questions if you have time to look at what's in the Q&A. But before you do that, there's also been quite a few people asking if you can post the links to the 3 laws that you described in the chat. That would be really helpful. But again, if you have a little bit of time to answer questions, that'd be great.
I'll see what I can do. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very, very much for all you're doing in New York and for sharing this as well. Thanks so much for joining us. Okay, we're going to move on in our agenda. We had actually hoped to have Veronica Beatty from California Coalition for Rural Housing join us. Unfortunately, she both had some technical issues getting on and then was called into an emergency meeting. So a lot going on in California these days. We completely understand. She's actually not going to be able to join us for today's call. Hopefully we'll be able to bring Veronica back next week or at a future call. So we're going to jump over that. Now we're going to move on to what's going on with emergency rental assistance spending and some additional erase and rental arrears to stop evictions updates from Sarah Gallagher, our erase project director at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and Emma Foley, research analyst at NLIHC. So I'm not sure which one of you is going to go first. Emma, is that you?
Yep, sure, I'll take it away.
Okay, great.
So the U.S. Department of Treasury released updated emergency rental assistance spending data through the end of July. They released that about 2 weeks ago on August 25th. The data revealed that an additional $1.68 billion in ERA funding was spent in the month of July. But as you can see in the graph, after steady increases in ERA spending rates from January through June, the amount spent in July only grew slightly, increasing from $1.53 billion spent in June to $1.68 spent in July. This data shows that a total of $4.7 billion in assistance had been paid to households and a total of $5.2 billion had been expended, which included administrative costs and housing stability expenditures. The data also shows that far more households are applying to ERA than have been served through ERA. So by June 30th, 2.3 million households had applied, but by the end of July, less than half of those had received assistance. These numbers confirm that backlogs in application processing are likely slowing down the dispersal of ERA funding and points to the needs for increased program flexibilities. Next slide. As the Treasury data continue to point to the slow progress that many programs are continuing to experience. At the end of July, 16 states had spent less than 5% of their allocation, and nearly 50 localities had spent less than 5% of their allocation. State programs together continued to spend less than local programs, spending approximately 16% of their funding, while localities fared a bit better, spending around 33% of their ERA1 funding. Next slide. NLIHC is also tracking spending progress in real time on our ERA spending tracker. It's linked at the bottom of this slide, and maybe one of my colleagues could post the link in the chat as well. It's nlihc.org/ERA-dashboard. And the tracker uses data from the Department of Treasury, as well as real-time data dashboards, reports, communications with administrators, and news articles. And the tracker includes the most up-to-date data that is available on payments that have been approved or paid out. Though the most recent Treasury data revealed that spending progress was unacceptably low in the month of July, our tracking shows that funding may be ramping up. As of today, NLIHC is tracking approximately $7.5 billion that has been expended or obligated. Next slide. NLIHC's tracking indicates that as of today, at least 30% of ERA1 funds have been spent or obligated. States have seen the highest uptick in funding paid or obligated, with an estimated $5.4 billion as of today. And while several states have still spent close to 0% of their funds, others have made very significant program changes to increase the efficiency of their funding distribution. We've highlighted some of these on past calls, such as Texas and Virginia, which have both made great progress in their ERA programs. And today I wanted to highlight a few other states that have made significant progress in the last several months. Next slide. These graphs show month-to-month state spending. And I want to preface this by saying there's still room for improvement for all ERA programs, but these examples show that when programs course correct and integrate necessary program flexibilities like self-attestation or direct tenant assistance or fact-specific proxy, they can greatly ramp up their funding. Starting with two of the largest states with high numbers of low-income renters, as Ellen already discussed, distribution in New York started off very, very slowly, but the state has since made some upgrades to the application process and the website. It has also redirected some state employees to the program to increase capacity and speed up processing. Recently, Governor Hochul also announced that the state will invest an additional $1 million in marketing and outreach efforts to raise awareness about the program. And as you can see in the graph, after months of spending nothing, the state spent nearly $300 million in August alone. California has also seen an uptick in funding, though experiencing a slight dip in the month of August. They're still dispersing large amounts of funding, over $100 million per month after a pretty slow start. Major changes to the program include making tenants and landlords whole, that is increasing the amount of rent paid from 80% to 100%. California is also partnering with a huge number of community agencies across the state to offer culturally and linguistically responsive outreach and assistance completing the application. Next slide. Next to a slightly smaller states, though the state of South Carolina has spent a relatively low percent of their total funds compared to some other states, they recently made some really sweeping program improvements that have already resulted in a quick uptick in funding distribution. In particular, South Carolina Housing has reduced paperwork requirements and expanded outreach efforts and increased self-attestation. South Carolina Housing has also opted into using fact-specific proxy so that renters in almost 200 low-income zip codes will no longer have to document that their incomes are low enough to qualify. The state has also added additional staff to provide in-person and telephone support. And then lastly, Connecticut, the program is now covering, again, 100% of rental arrears, where it was previously covering only a partial portion of arrears. Landlords are also no longer asked to forgive a portion of the rent, which could increase landlord participation. And the state has also established fact-specific proxies where households in HUD-designated qualified census tracts are automatically income eligible for ERA. Next slide. So this resource that is linked is no longer very new, but if you haven't been on the call in a while, it might be new to you. This slide links to more detailed data that much of our analysis is based off of. We can also pop that in the chat. This includes program level data for programs with real-time data dashboards, as well as the most recent data we have available for each of the state ERA programs. Next slide. And then lastly, if you know of any data dashboards or have any other spending data after looking at our resources, any other updates, we're always happy to hear them and to incorporate them. And so please feel free to email that information to research@nlihc.org. And now I will go ahead and turn it over to Sarah Gallagher.
You know, before you turn it over to Sarah, let me just ask a couple of questions. One is a very fundamental one. It came in from one of our listeners, Danielle Mowry. Can you just clarify what you mean by ERA1? How much is that? Is it the first amount that was approved at the end of 2020, or is it the March amount?
Yes, definitely. So this tracking is all just using the denominator of ERA1, which was the 25 billion passed at the end of December. We've started to see some states and localities starting to spend down ERA2, and the more that we see that, we'll also begin to incorporate that into our tracking. But for now, it just includes that 25 billion.
Great, Emma. And I actually wanted to ask you another question that came in before the call. Somebody who registered for the call sent in a question that said, when can local governments start using the Biden funds, ERA2, for, actually this was for non-COVID emergency rental assistance. Our county says they have to use all their COVID funds first, but I imagine what they're referring to is the new COVID resource ERA funds that came during the Biden administration in March. They will begin they can begin using ERA2 now, is that right?
Yes, they can. And we've seen several places where perhaps a household doesn't qualify for ERA1, but would qualify for ERA2. Places, even if they haven't spent down all of their ERA1, going ahead and pulling from that pot of funding to help the most households possible.
And they can also use their state and local funds for these kinds of purposes as well if they choose to. Okay, very good. All right, there's another question here. Is there any hope that ERA funds will get out much faster in the near future? And I think that's actually a good question for our next speaker. So Sarah Gallagher is the project director for the ERASE project, and she'll take it over now.
Great. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Emma, for all that really rich and robust information. It's so helpful to get such real-time information on the spending. And so, hi, everybody, I'm Sarah Gallagher, and I just wanted to take just a few minutes because you've heard a lot of information around sort of low spenders and high spenders and course correction. And here at NLIHC, we've really been talking to folks and looking at the research to look at themes that may be helping with maybe differentiating between high spenders and low spenders. And these themes are based off of, like I said, conversations with different administrators or state partners, as well as some of the research that we're seeing. And we thought it would be helpful to highlight this because there is so much information and maybe help you focus some of your activities and actions on those strategies that will have the biggest impact to be able to get funding out the door to those who do need it the most. So as Emma said, and we heard a lot of programs have been course correcting or changing their way they're administering funds over the last few months. And it's really allowed us to look at some of these strategies and what impact they're having. So I wanted to cover just a couple of these themes quickly today and help you think about how to use these going forward. First I wanted to talk about one of the things we're seeing is that one of the differences between some of the low spending programs and some of the higher spending programs is this how much capacity and infrastructure they're able to build. We're starting to see that some of the programs that have really been able to spend significant amounts of their dollars are really investing in increasing staffing, in developing more advanced technology and infrastructure to really handle the influx of applications and to process the applications as quickly as possible. We've seen this success in some of the most high spending states and programs, such as the state of Alaska and Texas, Louisiana and Kentucky has really increased their staffing. And they're doing this through several strategies, through increasing internal staff, through sort of transitioning staff and redeploying them into the ERA program, as well as doing more temporary hires or maybe hiring interns and even subcontracting with community-based organizations to help build the capacity of the ERA program. I think in the state of Alaska, they hired over 100 people to staff a call center, reach out to tenants and landlords, and to process applications to support program administration. So really encouraging in programs to utilize the administrative dollars and to utilize the housing support services to really build a solid program that is well staffed and has capacity to process applications. Another theme that we're seeing is that those states that are able to really get the money out the door quickly are building out a robust and equitable outreach programs with trusted community partners. They've really been able to develop unique partnerships, engage with community organizations that are trusted in different communities and with those who are most marginalized, to both outreach to renters as well as to help renters and landlords through the application process. So providing that support to get documentation, to check on applications, and to really answer some of the questions that they may have in real time and answer them from a trusted community partner that they may have a relationship with. One of the examples we've seen of this was in Richland, South Carolina, where ERA program administrators are working really closely with the public library to provide access to applications and offer application support. Everything from telephone calls to coming to the library to be able to fill out an application, and even text messaging documentations when needed, when someone might not have access to the internet to be able to upload a document themselves. That library support is providing that service for households who are in need. And it's really helped, as Emma noted before, increase spending in the program. We're also seeing these community partnerships being built through contractual relationships between ERA programs and community-based organizations. In Columbus, Ohio, they have an RFP where they're really looking to engage community partners who are working with specific marginalized populations and have relationships to be that trusted boundary spanner and to help with that. As well, in Honolulu, their ERA program is working with nonprofit partners to look at different neighborhoods which are high need, as well as specific populations. So really thinking about how can you engage and contract with your community-based partners to provide that trusted service. Thirdly, we're seeing, and Emma talked about this a bunch, that really having simple, accessible applications is key to success. Really looking at the documentation requirements, limiting the amount of documentations you need, using proxies, categorical eligibility, have all helped have programs that are fast moving, that can process quickly, and that are low barrier to tenants. We've seen with some of the lower spending programs that they can have really high incompletion rates with their applications, which then turn into denial rates if those go on for a long time. So really thinking about how to support people and make sure that those are low barrier applications. I think we mentioned before the use of data, and we're seeing several programs use administrative data matches between Medicaid or the ERA program or other state and federal programs to get that documentation on an administrative end so that people are categorically eligible and they don't have to find that documentation themselves. So that's been very beneficial in many of the high spending programs. And lastly, I'll talk about, oh, there's two more actually. The second to last is thinking about access to the application. One theme we have seen is that in many of the programs that are spending, they have multiple ways to access the application and are not relying on an online application. We've seen in some of the states that are maybe slow spenders that if there's only an online application, people in rural communities or someone who may not have internet or broadband access isn't able to access the application and upload documents the way they may be if they had multiple ways to access and to complete an application. So really thinking about flexibility and how someone can complete that application. And then lastly, we see that several of the high spending states and local programs are really looking at demonstrating strategies to engage landlords and to implement tenant protections to ensure that people are not falling through the cracks as they're going through the process. They're doing this through landlord engagement strategies, through landlord networks, and really talking to landlords to see what they need and how do they need to access the program. Some states and local programs have developed registries that landlords can register on so that they can really facilitate their access to the program. And then having tenant protections that are in place, like we heard in New York, whereas you're going through the process, you're not evicted while that's happening and while the application may be being processed. The third component of that is that we've seen when there's a direct tenant option related to that access, it really helps if a landlord decides they're not going to participate, that program can still provide assistance directly to the tenant. And that ensures that a tenant doesn't lose out on the support and assistance they need because a landlord is not participating. So those are some of the strategies. I really highly encourage folks to look at our NLIHC resource hub. We've got our erase checklist, as well as many tools and examples of applications and processes from other programs around each of these areas that you can use in thinking about course correcting or making tweaks to your own program at the local or state level. So thank you, and I will pass it back over to Paul.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. So here's a question that came in from Nathan Reeder. How have high spending areas negated the risk of providing funds to self-attested applicants that may ultimately be deemed ineligible households once the documents are collected within 6 months as required by the updated Treasury guidance? Is this a reason why low spending areas have been releasing funds at such a slow drip?
That's a great question. And I don't know if we have data on what happens after that 6-month period, but I will say when we talk to programs that have transitioned to lower documentation or self-attestation, they have not seen higher rates of folks being ineligible for the program because of that. People are being sort of truthful in their self-attestations and they're panning out to be eligible applicants. So that hasn't been a barrier we've heard of. If folks are having different experience with that, please reach out to us so we can understand that and look into it. But I think that is a fear many folks have, but we don't have the data yet to sort of say how it's panning out.
And just to be clear, programs, and there are existing programs that have used self-attestation saying that additional documentation is actually not necessary, that we're going to base this on your sworn testimony, basically your attestation under that threat of legal action if you answer it wrong, if you're lying about it, it's you're able to attest it, and we're not going to ask for documentation afterwards, right?
Correct, Paul, that's right. That would be the documentation. And then my understanding is that the onus then goes on the tenant if something happens later on down the road, but the program has gotten all the documentation they need to be compliant to the federal program.
Right. Okay, I think that we're good in terms of additional questions. So thank you very much, Sarah and Emma, for your presentations today. And we'll be hearing from you at future calls, definitely. All right, we're going to move on now to our next presenter, and that is Sarah Sadian, Vice President of Public Policy at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. who's going to give us an update on everything happening in Capitol Hill and what we need to do as advocates. Sarah?
Awesome. So good to see from all of you guys, hear from you guys. We are so close to having this infrastructure and economic recovery bill be released and start to move through the process in the House and Senate. The committees are putting their final touches on their bills to invest more than $330 billion in affordable housing through a larger $3.5 trillion infrastructure package. We expect the committee to release the details of what's included in their bill as soon as tomorrow. So we'll have a good sense of where we are in terms of our top priorities. Some committees are voting on their bill this week. House Financial Services Committee is going to vote on their bill on Monday, September 13th, which, as I said, is only a short couple of days away. And so our advocacy between now and then is really important. Once the bill passes out of each committee, the House Budget Committee is going to combine all of them into one package. It'll get a vote on the House floor by the end of the month, and then it'll head to the Senate, where we do expect some changes to be made, but there's a lot of work we can do to protect the resources that we have and hopefully ensure that those changes are not super difficult or bad. We do expect, so just so you know, we know that the House Financial Services Committee and the Banking Committee has been working hand in hand to put together this draft bill. But we should think of the House bill when it comes out tomorrow or the next day as being a high watermark for what we can achieve in this infrastructure package. We know that Senator Manchin and Sinema have repeatedly said that $3.5 trillion is too much. Most recently, Manchin said he wanted to put a pause on the process and slow down. So there's an opportunity there, or a risk there rather, that we could see that top line number brought down and housing investments cut as a result. So we have a lot of work to do over the next month. In terms of what you should be doing over the next couple of days, you know, from my perspective, we should be using this time between today and the 13th to try to push as hard as possible on our top priorities, because there might be a little bit more wiggle room between now and then. Please continue to contact your members of Congress and urge them to support the House priorities, which includes $180 billion for rental assistance, $70 billion for public housing, and $45 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. I know I say this a lot, but Congress really needs to hear from you. We are coming down to the wire. This is the moment for your advocacy. So if you've been holding off or you're afraid of reaching out to your member of Congress too often because you don't want to be annoying to them, don't worry about that at all. Contact them repeatedly. The squeaky wheel gets the oil, or whatever they say, so keep at it. It's really important that we are focusing on our message and making sure that resources are reaching the people with the greatest needs. I'm going to share into the chat box a link to our updated talking points and our national sign-on letter so that you can use those when you're talking to your members of Congress, but also, there we go, sign on to the national letter if you haven't already. There are about 1,300 organizations on board so far, and we'd love to send them an update in the next day or so with even more folks on board. In terms of ERA legislation, we know that we've talked about last week that Chairwoman Waters is looking at legislation to reform the emergency rental assistance program. It's likely to be the subject of a hearing in Financial Services Committee on Friday, where Diane will be testifying. We're looking forward to that. We have weighed in with Waters over the last week, giving her our recommendations for any emergency rental assistance bill. Our goal here is to look at reforms that would help expedite funding and get it into the hands of renters more quickly, but also to make sure that when landlords apply for assistance directly, that there are really robust renter protections in place to make sure that renters are benefiting from those resources. We also expect a vote on this bill once it's released as soon as Monday in House Financial Services Committee. That could be combined with a vote on the budget reconciliation package. It could be separate. That's a little bit unclear, but we do know that Waters is very focused on trying to move that forward. And then lastly, I'll just let folks know we're holding a congressional briefing on September 9th, this Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern time. The briefing is really intended for Hill offices, but you're welcome to attend if you'd like. The title is Housing is Infrastructure, what the latest research tells us about housing solutions that are needed in the infrastructure package. Our hope here is that we can really drive home what research has said from our GAP report and our Out of Reach report and other research that makes the case for why we need investments in rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund. Chairwoman Maxine Waters will be joining us for that event and making some opening remarks. We'll also include speakers, including Curtis Johnson from Catholic Charities, Harry Lawson from the National Education Association, Emma Mirabi from Children's Defense Fund, Dan Threet from our own NLIHC team, myself and Diane. Really glad that we're having a really broad audience here to help drive home the case for these resources and the just last couple of days before we see the House committee vote on it. So I'm going to share with you, I think actually we already shared in the chat box a link to register. Just encourage you guys to share that with your members of Congress. If you're already reaching out to them about the House campaign priorities and the infrastructure bill, this is a good thing that you can add as well in your email to them. Invite them to attend, let them know that we can answer any of their questions that they might have at that time. And with that, I will turn it back over to Paul.
Thank you, Sarah. As always, great overview and really exciting times. And as Sarah said, there's lots that we all need to be doing. So please contact your members of Congress. We shared the talking points you can use when you contact your member of Congress by phone, by email. Sign on to the national letter supporting the HoUSed campaign's priorities if you haven't already done so. Join us for the congressional briefing on September 9th. That's this Thursday at 3 p.m. And the link to register is in the chat box. We'll leave it up there for a second. So, you know, this is the time. We are at a really once in a generation, maybe once in a lifetime opportunity here to achieve really, really robust investments in affordable housing for those most in need. We have an opportunity here to really end homelessness, begin to end homelessness and housing poverty in the United States, but we need all of your help to get that done. So please join us in every way that you can. I don't see any other questions for Sarah Sadian. So with that, I will close this national call a little bit early. Thank you all for your advocacy. Please keep at it. The next few weeks are absolutely essential. So thank you very much. Take care, everybody. See you next week.